Welcome to our Cybersecurity Awareness Month education session. My name is Ryan Smith. I'm president of RLS Consulting, and I'm here to help you learn a little bit more about cybersecurity as we go through this October Cybersecurity Awareness Month. In today's topic, we're going to talk about addressing our risks. And as we get into that, we're going to talk about understanding a couple different areas where we can focus to make some impacts. We're going to look at things that we talked about in our last video around reducing likelihood and reducing impact. Those are the key factors that attribute to our risk. So those are the things we want to reverse. And then we'll share some common practices that you should know about that are going to help you be safer at home and in the office. So first, we want to think about some of the things we talked about in our first lesson. And this gets back into the flow of information and the risk equation that we introduced to you. So just a quick refresher on that. When we think about the flow of information, we want to think about how information is protected at each step in this flow. We have the person that's got the information, or yourself in this example, you're connecting to a device. That device is then going to connect to a network, which is going to be used to share information across the internet to get access to different types of websites, applications, maybe data or file storage, whatever it might be. Maybe you're accessing another network that's your office. As we think about this flow, that's where those risks are that we need to start to weigh. And as we start to weigh the risk in each area here, we need to think about the likelihood and impact. So the likelihood was the factors that related to the weaknesses that we have there. So what vulnerabilities exist? What are ways that could be easy for a person to detect that there's a vulnerability there? Maybe they already know, just in the nature of how our business works, that a person might be an easy to detect weakness. Maybe something's easy to attack. So this could be something that's simple for an attacker to be able to get into, or maybe something might be a little harder and it requires advanced skill set. So that's going to be a lower likelihood. But what are those ones that are easy to attack that especially attackers might be aware of? So is this something they're actively looking for, or is this something really unique to your office? And then what protections are in place to be able to stop that person, or at least if anything, maybe alert you to something going on. So we need to think about those factors where something really has a high area of likelihood because it checks a lot of these boxes. Those are the things we're going to want to prioritize. The next part we introduced was the impact. This has to do with confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the CIA triad of cybersecurity. The simple way to think about that is privacy, trust, and reliability. So where's private information we need to maintain confidentiality around? Where are we focusing on trust, where if something was compromised and manipulated, it would impact decisions or processes we have? So where are we really ensuring that we have a way to validate trust and information? And then availability and reliability. Where are the things that we depend on the most? And what we're going to need to think about here is how we reduce the impact of that, is how we come up with a backup plan if that thing's not going to be there. So let's dive a little bit deeper into this. So first, looking at likelihood, we need to start to understand where our weaknesses are. So think about that flow of information and particular areas that maybe you have control over that could determine areas of weakness. So first, the things that are easy to detect. We need to start to think about the areas that are really easy for attackers to discover. Now, they know they can trick people, so we always know that people are going to be a big area of risk here. Now, there might be other things, and this is good for you to know at the personal level. You know, you might have certain things that are available for people to be able to discover about you out on the web. And so if there's information they can use or gather, that's going to help make it a little bit easier for them to detect maybe that they have a good target here. And in a lot of cases, we're using tools and things like AI now, where attackers are using those too to make it a little bit easier for them to launch attacks, do their research and things like that too. So this brings us into that next category, is what's going to be really easy to attack. It's going to be really important for you to understand, you know, things that you need to pay close attention to. If you have something that's easy to attack, maybe because you have personal information out there, or maybe there are some low-hanging fruit because you haven't done a whole lot of security practice in your personal life or in your business, well, those are things that you're going to really want to pay close attention to, because the easier it is to attack, the more attention you probably need to have on that thing, just in case somebody does try something. And then awareness. This is where it's really important to be aware of what kind of current threats are out there and what different things attackers are doing, because this is what they're looking for. And so if there are things that we're reading about in the news and all of that, those are things that we really want to prioritize and understand so that we can stay more vigilant too and stay ahead of the attackers a little bit. And then what kinds of protection can we put in place? So we want to reduce our likelihood. One of the things we can do is have layers of security. A great example of this is having a strong password and having multi-factor authentication, or MFA. That means that not only does somebody have to have a password, something that you know, they need that extra factor. Maybe a device that you have, maybe it's your fingerprint, maybe it's a retina that you're scanning, something that basically is that extra piece. Now, it's not going to stop all attacks, but it's going to make it harder for them to get in and maybe slow them down in some cases. If anything, some of these different things that we can put in place to protect ourselves, like antivirus, might alert us more quickly to respond to an attack. So as we think about these different factors here, we want to think about ways to undo them. What are ways to make it harder to detect things? What are ways to make it harder to attack things we have out there? What are attackers already aware of and looking for that we can be ahead of them on? And then how can we add those extra layers to protect ourselves? The next thing we need to start to think about is how we reduce our impacts. This is a little bit harder. If you recall from the last lesson, these have to do with how we use our technology and the processes and everything that are involved in our business. We probably can't get rid of things like sensitive information. That's probably a necessity for how we operate, but we can start to think about how we handle that. So looking at the CIA, one of the things with confidentiality we want to think about is how we really minimize our digital footprint. How do we make sure that we don't have sensitive data in places where it's not needed, or think about it more as operating on a need to know basis. The more information that's out there, the more places it can be intercepted, the more impact that will have. So as you think about this at home or in the office, it's that need to know basis that we need to think about. Let's minimize our digital footprint. And then anything we do have out there, look at different ways to protect it. That's where things like encryption and things like that can really help protect sensitive information. The next thing would be integrity. How are we maintaining trust? Well, one of the things that's really tricky about this is we don't know when we've had a compromise in a lot of cases, so we might not know that the trust is gone. So maybe we're looking at reports, making decisions, and somebody's manipulated numbers. Maybe we got an invoice from somebody and somebody's changed the routing numbers and changed information. We're going to pay a threat actor instead. Or maybe you're communicating with somebody that you think you know because they're using their email account, but it turns out to be a bad guy. So these are places where we need to start to think about ways to validate trust. We need those processes to be able to double check things, especially when there's a higher risk activity, like the invoice example. If there's a high dollar amount, there's probably a good reason to pick up the phone and just verify something, especially if there's last minute changes and things like that. So we want to have those processes in place to validate trust. The last part would be the availability piece. This is where we're dependent on a piece of technology, a process, maybe a device. What happens when that's not there when we need it because it's been compromised? So a great example of this is a ransomware attack. And one of the ways that you can get back up and running faster is by having a backup. So for different things that you're highly dependent on, have you thought about what would happen to you if that piece of technology or whatever it might be is not there when you need it? What's your backup plan? How can you get it back up and restored quickly? And is there something else that you could do manually, maybe through that process? For example, if it's an automation that's gone, how can you get back and do this manually if you have to in the meantime? So what's your backup plan? As you start to think about these different areas, there's a few things that you're probably familiar with that are worth knowing. And these are great things to be doing at home again. So not just for use in the office, but also to protect you and your family. First, strong passwords. In a lot of cases, it's hard to remember passwords. I highly recommend Password Manager if that makes sense to get one. It is a little bit safer, even though you have all your passwords in one spot. You have an ability to use more randomized passwords and they're less likely to get guessed. And then you can use one really strong password to protect that password manager. And also that's where you'd use multi-factor authentication. But one of the problems that people have is because passwords are such a pain to deal with, they'll use simple passwords that are easy for them to remember, or they'll use the same password in different places. Well, when that gets out there, attackers can find that. And even if they found other passwords from you from other breaches that have happened over the years, they can get an idea of how you create them based on things that they know about you. So they might be able to figure out that you're using your dog's name or your kids' names and things like that in your password and be able to come up with some variations that make it a lot easier for them to guess what your current password is. So having really strong, long, and randomized passwords is one of the best ways that you can do that. If you can't get a password manager that does randomized passwords, another thing that can help you is to go beyond passwords to passphrases and use something that's really unique to that system that you're creating the password for. That's just another little trick that might make it a little bit easier for you to remember what's there, but it's also a little harder to guess because it's a phrase instead of just a word. The next thing would be multi-factor authentication. MFA is another way to create an extra barrier, a layer of defense for somebody that might be able to figure out your password. Now, you can still trick something as far as MFA goes to be able to get by that. It's not foolproof. Nothing is a silver bullet with security, but it's one of those things that's hopefully going to slow down that attacker to where they move on. Now, we talked about this just a moment ago, but having two or more factors for our authentication would mean something you know, your password, and something typically you have, which could be a device, it could be your fingerprint, your retina, your face, all these different tools that help have that other factor that is just another way to verify you. I would be careful because not all MFA is equal. You can have things where an MFA code goes to your email or gets texted to you. Those things can be intercepted. So if somebody has access to your device or if they've compromised your email account, for example, they can intercept that and now they have access to your accounts. So we do want to think about using MFA applications that actually have a PIN and different things that you use. It's a little bit safer method. The next thing would be antivirus. Another really important one to have at home. Your office probably already has that. There's next level of antivirus where it's using AI and heuristics to look at behaviors and identify things that might just not be a typically known attack. So this can get really intelligent for you and actually be a really great way to alert you towards, different types of threats. More advanced antivirus might be called endpoint detection and response, but these are really important tools that can help tell you if something's going on that maybe is out of the norm that needs your attention. The other side of this is encryption. We talked a little bit about confidentiality. When you have sensitive data out there, there are different places where that data might be stored, including your device or file storage, or maybe you're sending it to somebody. In different places, depending on the level of sensitivity of that data, encryption might be a way to help protect it. So if somebody does still intercept that information, now it's a little bit harder for them to crack into it. We also talked about availability and the importance of being able to return to work. So having a backup is going to be really important. This might be things like maybe emails that you need to have backed up. Maybe it's information in a database. However this looks for you in the personal or work world is really going to depend on the technology that you use and the data that you interact with on a regular basis. But having a plan for how you can restore that if something ever disappears on you is going to be a really important piece to help you get back to life as it was. The other part of this too is security settings. There are a lot of different tools that you might be using at home and at work, and a lot of times these offer really great security configurations on the back end. So making sure that you can turn on things like the requirement for MFA or other different security settings that get handled around privacy, for example. So in your most critical systems, thinking about the things that have high likelihood and high impact because of the dependency on it or the types of information that's in it, you might want to apply more advanced security settings and take a look at some of the configurations you have available to turn on. Just remember, nothing really comes turned on outside of the box, so you might actually have to review these settings when it comes to things like your social media accounts, your bank, or other applications you're using for work. I would particularly prioritize things that have sensitive data or that are used for communication or financial resources. The other part is security awareness. We talked about the importance of staying a little bit ahead of attackers, understanding what's happening in the world. So taking trainings like this to learn a little bit more about things you can do to protect yourself and what attackers are doing is going to be a great way to really stay ahead of the curve. And then responding quickly. This is really important part of it too. The faster you can identify and contain an attack, the lower that we've seen the cost of the associated breach be. So if you want to reduce the cost and impacts of things on you, whether it's personally or at work, you want to be able to take action as quickly as possible. Now, a lot of times attackers are trying to stay hidden. They're trying to do their best to not get caught. Usually once they start making noise and doing things, they've been in your system for a long time. In fact, there was a report from IBM that they do every year that shows almost 200 days or more that most attackers are in the environment before they're detected. And this number fluctuates year over year, but it's a long period of time that somebody's in there hiding. And part of that's because they want to intercept information, they want to learn a little bit more, and they want to launch a more sophisticated attack. But in some cases, things do happen really quickly too. But as soon as you see something going on, it's going to be really important for you to take action so you can minimize the impacts on yourself. So getting back to thinking about how we protect ourselves, we want to think about some of the things that we suggested reflecting on in the last video. Where are those areas where you have a high likelihood and high impact that really become those high areas of risk? Think about that flow of information and where your high areas of risk are, both at home and at work. Now, as you think about those, where could you put extra security practices in place? Where can you look at your passwords, your MFA, your security settings, and some of these other things that we talked about in the previous slide? Those are things we need to start to look for and watch for those opportunities where we can really tighten up what we're doing. There are probably some simple things you can do already, and especially making sure like that low-hanging fruit around Passwords and MFA, for example, are a really great place to start, but start to look at the different technology that you use. Think about that flow of information and watch for those extra areas where you can add more ways to protect yourself.